We covered on the last hour at 10 o'clock, we covered I don't remember what we covered at this point. It's all a blur. We covered the MLA addendum, which is the new multiple listing, or MLS addendum. MLSA is it, the multiple listing service addendum. Um, Now we're going to jump into some of those buyer forms. We're going to talk about the buyer representation and broker compensation agreement and the SPBB. I was going to try to do one form an hour, and then I realized with taking a break for the next 2 hours for the processional to happen, so that everybody could attend that, because it's way more important than these forms. And then because we have limited hours in the day and I started late, that I'm going to have to group some of the forms together. So we're going to cover the BRBC and the SPBB. And again, we're going to be doing a Q&A tomorrow at 11 o'clock. So if you have any questions on these forms, if you want to look at them yourself, you go to car.org, click on the red tabby at the top. There's like a line that goes across saying that there's going to be a new forms release, and that'll take you to that. So this is the BRBC, the Buyer Representation and Broker Compensation Agreement. This needs to get signed starting now. Let's say starting now. It's really not until August, but starting now for all new buyers before you go see a property. There's a secondary form that you can use that's a little less obligatory, let's say, for maybe those first time Zillow clients or whatever. We'll cover that later today. In fact, I think we're covering that one at 2 o'clock today. It's the PERSA, I think is what it's called. But let's jump into the changes to this form. Number one, it's saying non-exclusive unless inclusive. Sorry, let's try this again. Non-exclusive unless exclusive is checked and initialed. So that's down further. And then they've changed this whole form, just like the listing agreement. They've changed it over to look more like the purchase agreement in the grid format. So this is non-exclusive. And let's start here at the top. Remember to you're going to put the buyer's names here, and then you're going to put Realty One Group Fox on that second line under number 1. Exclusive is checked unless exclusive is checked in paragraph 2A2 and initialed in paragraph 15. It's a non-exclusive right, and the representation period is going to be specified in 2A1. Okay, so here's the terms of representation. The items in this paragraph are contractual terms of the agreement. Referenced paragraphs provide further explanation. This form is 5 pages, and the buyer is advised to read all 5 pages. So remember, just like the residential listing agreement or the purchase agreement, and now the listing agreement that's coming out tomorrow, you've got the grid format, which gives you, this is 2A, 2B, 2C, right? And then in this second column here, that's going to reference the paragraphs in which it's referenced in more detail, or detailed in the document itself. So like if we scroll down to paragraph 7, it's going to talk about properties excluded from representation and give that definition and what that entails. Okay, so grid 2A is representation. A1 is the representation period. This is the beginning date and the ending date. So it ends at 11:59 on blank date or upon completion of resulting transaction, whichever comes first. Okay, this is not to exceed 3 months. Okay, if you put more than 3 months on here, it's going to be void unless the buyer's a corporation, LLC, or partnership. So I know we're in the habit of like putting 1 year on there. No more. Sorry, it's 3 months. We're representing them for 3 months. At the end of 3 months, we've got to get a new one signed. Good practice could just be having a new one signed every time we fill out a purchase agreement for an offer to be submitted or whatever, but make sure that you calendar when these are going to expire, so you put a new one or a modification to extend the agreement. A2 is the type of representation. Non-exclusive is the default. I highly recommend that we check the exclusive. Okay, check exclusive there, type of representation. That means if they buy any property, whether we introduced it to them or not, we are due a commission. Okay, the non-exclusive is only if there was broker involvement do we receive commission. Property acquired is B. Broker, including any associate licensees working through broker on behalf of buyer, provides services for the types of properties and locations specified below. Property type. What kind of properties are they looking at? Single family residential, including condominiums and manufactured homes, or if checked, single family residence is excluded from this agreement. Okay, so the default is single family, condos, manufactured homes. So anything that's considered single family residential. Multiple family, right? Those are like duplexes, triplex, fourplex. Units with 5 or more would be the next checkbox. Industrial, vacant land, commercial, TICs, which are tenants in common, or the following specified properties only. Okay, so for the most part, we're going to leave it set to the default of single family. For the most part, that's what we're looking at. You may also want to check single family and multifamily. So however you want to do that. But for the most part, it's going to be single family. You're just going to leave it set at the default. Okay, location, cities and counties, right? It has here. You want to make sure you fill something out here, all the counties that you service. You can set this up in your templates to auto-populate any counties that you service. Number one, not only do we not miss something that way, but number two, it explains our values to the buyers when we're going through this with them. Here's all the counties that I service, okay? And you can let them know that if they want to look in a county that you don't service as your primary counties or one of those main service areas, that you can always refer them to another client that is a specialist in those areas. That way you make sure you maintain that referral fee. Okay. You can check the box for cities or counties, one of the two. And then there's additional description down here on B3. So those describe the properties to be acquired. Do not leave that section blank. Okay. Let's see here. Additional buyer preferences and priorities. That's the CAR form BIPP, attached buyer identification of preferences and properties. We'll be covering that form later today. But if we want to check that box, we can. Properties excluded from representation, or the properties identified on the attached list. So if they had prior showings with other agents where they signed a form, we'd want to make sure to identify those here or check this box here and put the attached list. Any questions so far? If you're on Zoom land, you can just unmute yourself and ask your question. If you're on Facebook, I'm watching the comments section. I'm going to open up the chat box as well so I can see that. So I can keep an eye on that as well. So if you have questions, you can throw them in that chat box. All right, moving on to section, I believe this is 2E, broker compensation. Notice the amount of real estate commissions is not fixed by law. They're set by each broker individually, may be negotiable between buyer and broker. See attached broker compensation advisory, CAR form BCA. We covered that yesterday. E1 is the amount of compensation. You're going to put a percentage there of the acquisition price, and if any blank, you can put in a $ there. So you can have percent and $. So you go X and Y, or you could put in here, that would be like a flat rate here. So if we're not going to take a percentage, we're just going to take a flat rate. We would check the box next to or and fill in that dollar amount. Or just like the listing agreement here, we've got a box that see attached compensation schedule. Okay, so where would a compensation schedule come into play? It may be like, hey, here's what I require compensation-wise. I take X% if the price is between X and Y. I take a flat fee if it's below Y. And I take a lower percentage if it's above X, right? So you could have a compensation schedule set up like that. It's up to you, but that's the type of thing that you might see on a compensation schedule for a BRBC. Payments received by broker or from sellers or others. If broker receives compensation from sellers or others for broker's representation of the buyer, the amount shall be credited against the buyer's obligation to pay broker, right? That's the same thing that we do now. We fill this out. We get X percentage from the listing brokerage, or we get compensated from the seller with the SPBB form. It subtracts from what the buyer owes us, okay? Now, in the past on the BRBC, it was set up that if we said, hey, buyer, you're responsible for X, and then seller is compensating us, or a third party is compensating us with Y, and Y is more than X, the overage goes to us, right? That was the default. Otherwise, there were some additional boxes. You could split it with the buyer. It could go to the buyer. Well, now we can't receive any excess commissions. Okay, so right here on E2 at the bottom, broker shall not receive any amount in excess of paragraph 2E1. That's what we filled in there. So make sure that you put your value in E1. Continuation right of payment for broker-involved properties. The continuation period shall be X calendar days after the representation period or any extension continuation period, right? That's where you're going to fill in like 90 calendar days after the representation period. That's what sets you up for either this expires or the buyer cancels on you. They can't turn right back around and make an offer on one of the properties that you were involved in helping get more information on or helping that showed them. Okay, so that's what that continuation period, similar to the one in the listing agreement. F is the cancellation rights and notice. Non-exclusive, cancellation effective upon receipt or blank days after receipt. And the exclusive is cancellation effective 30 days after receipt. That's why we usually go with exclusive for a couple reasons. That's one of them. Okay. G, any questions on E or F? Oh, Daniel, I'm not sure they were. Last time I logged into CAR, it was a red bar across the top of my car alerting me that new forms were being released. Before the next training, I'll try to find those and I'll try to make sure we have that link to share with you in the next training. I apologize that it's not still there. G is buyer financial personal information. Oh, if the property is offering less, Sadie asked, can E1 be modified? Absolutely, E1 can be modified, especially if the property is offering less or the seller's offering less and you agree to that. So you put X in there, they're only offering Y, it's less than X. Absolutely. The way that you would modify this, which we're going to cover later today, is there's a modification of terms for the buyer representation agreement. So you would just fill in that form with the modified new commission. Okay. Something you may want to think about too is anytime you go in there to modify a commission on that modification form, you may want to make it property specific so that if they do not complete the purchase of that agreement, you go back shopping for more properties, your commission reverts back to the original that was stated in E1 rather than the modified lower commission that you put on the modification. So you may want to make those modifications property specific. All right, buyer financial and personal information. Generally speaking, in the past, we've kind of just glanced over this section and moved on. This is becoming more and more important because not only do we want to make sure that they can actually purchase a home, but we want to make sure they have the funds available to be able to pay our commission in the chance the seller doesn't pay it. Okay, that's why this is going to come into play. Really important, this section G. So within 5 calendar days from the execution of this agreement, time to deliver buyer personal financial information is going to be within 5 days from the execution of this agreement, or the BFPI is attached. We're going to cover this BFPI form later today. It talks about the buyer financial and personal information, talks about where their closing costs are coming from, where their down payments coming from, all that information so that we have it. Other financial considerations in G2, buyer does not have sufficient funds to pay broker. Right? We're disclosing this up front. Let's have an honest conversation with our buyer so that we know what we're walking into. Buyer intends to purchase with the following loan product, which does not allow buyer to pay compensation to broker. I think for the most part now, all of our financing is allowing for it. But you may want to just double check with them or with their lender and then make sure we have those boxes checked. Because if the buyer doesn't have sufficient funds to pay broker, we know that we can't negotiate it as part of the purchase agreement, then we have to make a decision whether we're going to choose to represent them for free or not, right? Or what we're willing to take because we know buyer doesn't have any money. So just some things to talk about with your buyers there on G2. H is other terms. You know how CAR Forms likes our other terms. Any questions before we leave that new grid format? All right, and I apologize if you're on Facebook watching us live, there is a delay between Zoom and the Facebook Live. So when you throw your comments in the comments section, your questions in the comments section, I am watching them. It just takes a little while for them to pop up. So I'll always circle back to your answers.
I do have a quick question, Amy.
The next page talks about the, yeah, go ahead.
So I guess like in a scenario where you have a buyer that's unable to pay you because they don't have the funds to do so, and let's say I'm the listing agent, like how do we like, and the seller's not willing to pay for anything, like how do we even try to get that buyer represented if they really want the house? Like if they've signed this buyer broker compensation and I can't represent them because they have a agent that will represent them and the seller won't pay for it. Like how, and they still want to buy the house. Is there anything that we can do?
Yeah, it comes down to getting creative at that point. So if they're like, man, I don't want to go without representation. I don't want the listing agent to represent me. I want my agent to be able to represent me, but man, I can't pay them and the seller's unwilling to pay any sort of commission. Number one, it comes down to you go to a different house, or number two, let's talk to their lender and see if a slight bump in the interest rate allows the buyer to get some money back towards their closing costs to help cover their cost of that commission. Because that's probably the one creative way to do that, right? We know that on the lending side that the rate either is like at a cost or a rebate to the lender. And generally, if they bump their rate up a little bit, that helps them to cover their closing costs. They get a credit from the lender. So we could potentially do it that way. That's the one main way that I see that it could be done if the buyer absolutely has zero funds, seller's unwilling to pay any sort of compensation. Then that's probably the route that I would go. All right. Perfect. All right. Moving on from the grid, we've got the advisories, addendums, and disclosures. We got that BCA form that we covered yesterday. The broker compensation advisory is going to be automatically attached to this BRBC. Compensation to broker, right? So they've put all this verbiage in here on that continuation, updated this. This is all going to look like it's new because they've changed that format and added different verbiage to it. So let's see here. Real estate commissions, the amount of, hold on, compensation to broker. The amount of real estate commissions is not fixed by law. They are set by each broker individually and may be negotiable between buyer and broker. Advisory, real estate commissions include all compensation and fees to broker and are fully negotiable, right? It talks about non-exclusive representation, broker involvement. Compensation is payable only if there is broker involvement in the property, right? Broker involvement is not just emailing them automatically those listings. We actually have to have like made a call on their behalf or shown them the property. Like we had to do something besides just send them an email. Exclusive representation, buyer acquisition. If exclusive is checked, right, that's what I would highly recommend. And initialed in paragraph 15, broker is entitled to compensation if buyer acquires a property during the representation period or any extension with or without broker involvement, even if another broker is also entitled to be paid for representing the buyer. Buyer includes any person or entity other than the broker related to the buyer or who in any matter acts on buyer's behalf to acquire property described, right? So buyer one signs this, they decide their mother's going to buy the property for them so they don't have to pay a commission. Nope, sorry, this is buyer includes right there. Broker involvement, right? This is what it means. Buyer physically entered and was shown the property by broker. Broker showed the property to buyer virtually. Broker submitted a seller signed written offer from buyer to acquire, lease, exchange, or obtain an option on the property. Broker performed a market analysis related to the property or reviewed property specific documents or disclosures with the buyer. The property was introduced to the buyer or broker or one for which the broker acted on buyer's behalf. However, merely sending buyer a list of properties shall not be deemed broker involvement without documented action on part of the broker analyzing the property for the buyer specifically or assisting buyer in the potential acquisition of the property or communicating with the seller or seller's agent regarding buyer's potential acquisition. So broker involvement is any one of these things. Woo! So much. Continuation of right to compensation for broker involved properties, right? Broker shall be entitled to compensation provided for in 2E1 during the continuation specified in 2E3. Buyer enters into an agreement to acquire property for which there is broker involvement. Buyer's right to compensation pursuant to this paragraph shall apply only if prior to expiration of this agreement or any extension, broker delivers buyer written notice of those properties for which there was broker involvement. There's an MBIP form for that. We'll cover that later today, but you want to make sure you're tracking every single property you do any work for your buyers on. whether it's calling listing agents, setting up showings, whatever that is, more than just emailing them those listings. If we've done any work for them, we want to keep a running list of those properties. So in the case that they don't complete the purchase, they don't extend this agreement, or they cancel it, you can submit that list of properties to them. Any questions about that?
Let's
All
see.
Right.
Oh, yeah, I have a.
Oh, Irene, you're muted now. You were unmuted and now you're muted.
Okay, question. Is this recorded and can you email it to us? The whole 1 and 2?
No, it won't be emailed to you. You can find it on the Facebook group, the Foxhole Facebook group. It's being streamed live there. So those will be left there and up and posted for a replay. Or you can, we can give you the link for the YouTube channel and you can subscribe to that YouTube channel and then you can pull them up there.
Yeah, I need that. So, because I didn't attend the first meeting and the second meeting, what you just said, to keep track of everything you do. And that's just so you, so the buyer says, well, you didn't do very much for me. You said, this is what I did, and you show them a list. Is that what it is?
Yeah, so if they were to cancel this, you would just want that list of properties for which you did any work for them. You don't have to like justify the work that you did. You would just give them that list and that fulfills your obligation. Then if they turn around and purchased one of those properties, you would be entitled to compensation on it under the exclusive agreement.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. And Rebecca, to answer your question, that if a buyer buys a house with another agent while we have this agreement valid, is there any way to find out? No. I mean, there's no easy way to find out. The easiest way is to randomly search like title records, looking to see if they purchased a property. Then you could reach out to them and communicate that to them. We have had a couple instances where people have had BRBC signed and the buyers went and purchased a property with somebody else. One of them is being followed up on now, potentially taking legal action to see if we can, how this is going to stand up in court. But there's no easy way to do that. I apologize for that sad answer. All right. Timing of compensation. Compensation is payable right upon completion of resulting transaction through escrow. Broker shall be entitled to compensation whether any escrow resulting from this agreement closes during or after the representation period, right? So if this is going to expire and we have them in contract, we don't have to extend it once it's in contract. This just says that it can close after the representation period. If acquisition is prevented by default of the buyer upon buyer's default, right? So if they're going to forfeit their deposit, that's generally default. That would mean that not only are they forfeiting their deposit, but you could potentially also receive the commission at the same time. If acquisition is prevented by a party to the transaction other than the buyer, when buyer collects damages, obtains specific performance suit settlement, otherwise damages are recovered, compensation shall be equal to 1/2 of the damages recovered, not to exceed the compensation provided for in paragraph 2E1 after first deducting the unreimbursed payments, credits, and expenses of collection and suit, if any. So if they get damages or award through the court system. Payment through escrow, right? It's just saying this was all in the original. I don't know why it's red. They changed the verbiage a little bit, but the payment is going to happen through escrow. Okay, and we can submit this agreement as proof that payment is due. If the buyer is paying for part of your commission as part of the transaction, escrow needs to know about it the second that you open escrow on the property, as well as their lender is going to need to know about it as well. So you need to make sure that you're having those conversations and that they have copies of the documents showing that you're going to have a commission due from the buyer. Accounting for payments to broker if broker also represents seller. If broker has a signed listing agreement with seller of the property to be purchased, buyer shall not receive a credit for the compensation seller owes broker for representing the seller, right? So dual agency brokerage, whatever the buyer has agreed to pay, whatever the seller has agreed to pay is separate. If seller does not pay as contractually, let's see. Payments received from others less than buyer compensation obligation. Broker and buyer should discuss whether it would be beneficial to include a term in any offer buyer makes obligating the seller to pay broker directly or through escrow for some or all of the compensation that the buyer owes broker. If seller does not pay as contractually required, buyer assigns the broker as the third-party beneficiary any rights buyer has to pursue seller for such compensation, right? So they're just saying, hey, it's not the buyer's responsibility to go after your commission. If the seller fails to pay, it's your responsibility, and the buyer's assigning that responsibility to you. Disclosure of payments to broker. Broker independently or through escrow will disclose the final compensation broker receives from anyone other than the buyer. The easiest way to do that is on the CAR form ABCD. Okay, anticipated broker compensation disclosure. That's what we would submit to the buyer when we get ready to write the offers. We would fill out that ABCD form with the anticipated broker compensation, what's being offered from third parties. And then the bottom of that form, when it gets close to the close of escrow, that's where you fill out the final amount of compensation being received from those third parties. Cancellation of buyer representation agreement. It's just saying, hey, we can cancel at any time by giving written notice. So it's added in at any time there. Down here, properties excluded from representation, advisory regarding buyer signing multiple buyer representation agreements. Buyer shall inform broker in writing if buyer has signed any other buyer representation agreements, whether exclusive or non-exclusive, with any other broker for any properties described in 2B. With the fact that this is being required now, and there's a shorter form one that we'll cover later today, it's going to come up more and more that somebody has signed the previous agreement, whether it's valid or invalid. That's why I'd recommend that everybody does exclusive agreements, so it doesn't matter who shows them the property, you're entitled to the compensation. It keeps them a little bit more loyal instead of jumping around. Buyer shall disclose to broker if another broker showed buyer property virtually or in person, wrote another offer on, or otherwise acted on buyer's behalf for such property. Buyer may owe compensation to that broker if buyer purchases such property. Remember too, we have to present that list of properties. So the buyer cancels their agreement, the other brokerage, or you fail to give them that list of properties, the notice of broker involved properties, they don't have any obligation. And there's a time period for which you have to present that to them. But just kind of keep that in mind as well. You have to give them that list in order to get compensation once this has been canceled. All right. Broker signed an exclusive buyer representation agreement with another broker that has not expired or been terminated. Buyer may owe compensation to that broker if buyer purchases such property, even if that broker has no involvement with the property. Buyer shall disclose in paragraph 2D any property for which the buyer is obligated to pay another broker. Keep in mind too that the way that the compensation is now being structured, that if the buyer did have another buyer compensation agreement filled out with another brokerage, we negotiate the sale of the property, there's commission due. We're negotiating the commission now ultimately as part of the transaction. The buyer still may owe that other broker commission. If they failed to tell us that they had another agreement in place, they may owe both brokers, but technically the compensation should be due to you for the payment through escrow on that. And then they're going to have to go after the buyer separately for the additional compensation owed to that other brokerage. Hopefully that's how it'll be played out. It should be. Let's see here. Conflicts with other broker unless otherwise notified by buyer. Buyer acknowledges that for the property identified in paragraph 2B, excluding any property specified in 2D, buyer has not entered into an exclusive representation agreement with another broker and has no obligation even under a non-exclusive representation agreement to pay compensation to any other broker arising out of the acquisition of the property. On broker representation. If a property is excluded in paragraph 2D during the time buyer is obligated to compensate another broker, broker is not obligated to assist buyer with respect to that property. Buyer shall not owe broker compensation under this agreement for that property. So those were for the properties identified up here in section D of the grid, properties excluded from representation. All right. Let's see here. Timing, payments, counting, disclosure. Oh, we are down here. Conflicts. All right. Any questions so far? I know some of this information is new, but a lot of it falls in line. We've kind of been talking about this stuff for a while now. All right. Broker authorizations and obligations. Broker agrees to exercise reasonable effort and due diligence to achieve the purposes of this agreement. Right? So they just added that line in there. Buyer obligations. Financial and personal information within the time specified in paragraph 2G2. Buyer shall provide relevant personal and financial information, including but not limited to proof of funds needed to complete the purchase of the property and satisfy the obligation to pay broker. Okay. 9B2 is if either box is checked in paragraph 2G2 for any property for which the buyer writes an offer to purchase, buyer agrees to include a term in the buyer's offer requesting seller compensate buyer's broker, and for a transaction, this agreement is contingent upon seller or others or both agreeing to pay broker the full amount that the buyer is contractually obligated to pay broker. Okay, so that 2G2 was where the buyer didn't have the funds to pay the broker to pay our compensation. Okay. Management approval. If an associate licensee in broker's office enters into this agreement on broker's behalf, broker or manager has the right to cancel this agreement in writing within 5 days after its execution. What does this mean? Anytime we have a buyer broker agreement, it's probably going to need to get uploaded in the SkySlope. I don't know how we're going to work that as an office yet, but the manager, which means broker, Ed, Kara, have the right to review this document within 5 days of signature. Oftentimes, we're not uploading the BRBCs until we enter into contract on a property, which may be 30, 60, who knows how long after they've signed this agreement. So we need to upload this immediately. So we'll talk about what that looks like and how to do that without a transaction attached to it into SkySlope, or where we want those sent once they're signed. So just just wait for that announcement to come out. Legally authorized signer. This is just the legal. The buyer's representation agreement, Rebecca, never needed to be signed by the broker themselves. It was always signed by the agent. And so now they've said broker agent initials, even though it was always agent initials. And the way that we always defined that previously is when you screwed it down to the signature lines down here, it was always for the broker, it was always the agent's signature down here, even though the broker said that it was initialed. So the BRBCs were always agent initials, agent signatures. But yeah, so you absolutely can sign them, and we just need to make sure that they are in the broker's possession at some point. And like I said, we'll figure out how to do that. Legally authorized signer is the same as what you've seen on any of our others documents. It's just clarifying that whoever is the authorized signer, their signature counts on the agreement. Here's the new exclusive representation box. If exclusive is checked in paragraph 2A2 and initialed by buyer here, this agreement shall be exclusive. Broker will devote time and resources to assist buyer in finding and acquiring the property in the expectation of being paid for broker services. Buyer shall not enter into another representation agreement in conflict with this agreement. Broker is entitled to compensation if buyer acquires a property during the representation period, or with or without broker involvement, even if another broker is also entitled to be paid for representing the buyer. Either cancellation is either buyer or broker may unilaterally cancel this agreement by giving the other 30-day written notice. If within 5 days after the effective date of the cancellation, broker provides buyer, see 5 days after the effective date of the cancellation, broker provides buyer a list of properties for which there was broker involvement, broker may still be entitled to compensation if buyer purchases one of the properties on the list during the representation period or any continuation period specified in 2E3. Buyer's going to initial that paragraph. Okay. Again, I highly recommend exclusive representation. I can't express that enough. Confirmation of compensation. Buyer confirms the compensation specified in 2E1 for broker services as X% of the acquisition price. It's going to automatically populate this in this section from what we fill in the grid. We just updated it with the legally authorized signers like probate and such. Well, buyer signatures go there. Broker or agent signatures go here. If we have more than one agent from the same firm represents the buyer. Then we have the AAAA form. That's the additional authorized agent, and 2 brokers from different companies box, which is always there. Any questions on this BRBC, the change up on that form? All right. We're going to hop over. I'm going to cover one more before we finish up for this hour. It's going to be the SPBB form. This is the form that we utilize to why can't I think of the word? We're going to negotiate our commission directly with the seller on the buyer's behalf. Okay, we're going to use the SPBB form. We check the box in the residential purchase agreement that the SPBB is attached. This isn't, if the listing agent says, hey, seller's offering a X% cooperating commission, I'm going to pay you directly from my commission. Then we do the cooperating broker compensation agreement with the listing agent because we're getting paid from the listing brokerage. If we're not, we're getting paid from the seller themselves. This is, hey, seller's willing to offer commissions or pay compensation. We're going to use this form here for directly negotiating that commission on the buyer's behalf with the seller. The other way to negotiate your commission is just to negotiate it as a closing cost concession as part of the residential purchase agreement, seller concessions. Okay, seller concessions would count towards your commission. So there's a couple different ways to do this. This one is we're negotiating directly with the seller for that commission. So once we pull the commission from the MLS, we start using the new RLA, the residential listing agreement, where there is no compensation specified for cooperating brokerages. We want to make sure we're using this form just about every time. Okay. The following terms and conditions. Let's see. If seller concessions are counting towards commission, will this affect appraisals? It will affect appraisals, Rebecca, in the sense that those concessions are going to be displayed on the MLS after the close of escrow, right? So just like now, if there's concessions being paid for repairs or closing costs or whatever it is, that's displayed in the MLS. Any concessions that are getting paid towards the commission will also be displayed on the MLS. So in effect, absolutely it will. Generally, an appraiser deducts the concessions from the sales price to get what the actual sales price was. So in that sense, yes. No different than they are now. We're just going to maybe see them more frequently. If we do the seller payment to the buyer's broker, I don't think it will. So using the SPBB form and negotiating the commission directly with the seller versus doing it as a closing cost credit or a seller concessions, it's going to be reported differently. So I think that will not affect it. But we'll have to see if that plays out. This form's been in effect for a while, okay? But they have made some changes, as with everything. It's a one-page form. We fill it out. This is where we put in, the agreement, the property. We put the buyer's names, the seller's names. We put in the buyer's broker and the seller's broker as well, okay? All the parties get listed on this agreement. The rate of real estate commissions is not fixed by law, right? They're set by each broker individually, may be negotiable between seller and brokers. Real estate commissions include all compensation and fees to broker. Amount, subject to paragraph 1B below, seller agrees to pay buyer's broker X% of the purchase price, or if checked, X% out of the transaction proceeds. So this is how much we want the seller to pay us. Maximum seller payment obligation. Seller, for the most part, just so everybody knows, if on your BRBC you have X% listed, then on line A, it's going to be the same X%. Okay? Or the same, whatever's listed on that BRBC, oftentimes is going to be what's on line 1A. Okay? The difference may be if we're being offered a cooperating broker compensation from the listing brokerage. Okay, so let's say that we're asking for commission C on our BRBC. Okay, so we're asking for C percentage of commission. The cooperating broker compensation is A percentage, right? The letter A percentage. And we need B to make up the difference between A and C, between what's being offered as the cooperating and what's on our BRBC. Then the line on 1A may be the difference of that amount. Okay, just throwing that out there. That's only going to be temporary because cooperating broker compensation is going away. Okay, it's going to be a hard thing to adjust to because a lot of agents aren't going to be up on the trainings that say that we're not cooperating anymore, that we're going to negotiate with an SPBB instead of cooperating broker compensation. It's the same to the seller either way, but it's the way in which we're going to do business moving forward is using this SPBB for what would have been a cooperating broker compensation. All right. Maximum seller payment obligation. Seller shall only be obligated to pay buyer's broker the lesser of the amount specified in paragraph 1A, or the amount buyer is obligated to pay buyer's broker pursuant to their buyer representation agreement, and if applicable, less any amount that others have agreed to pay buyer's broker. If there is no buyer representation agreement, then seller has no obligation to pay buyer's broker. And you're like, Amy, how would they know? Well, we're required to provide them proof, which is why they've moved it to the signature page of the BRBC. So remember on the signature page of the BRBC, they've now got the commission on here. We would want to present page 5 of the signed BRBC along with this SPBB form. That's the proof of the compensation that the buyer has agreed to pay us. You have to have that buyer representation agreement in place with a commission on there in order for the seller to have any obligation to pay you whatsoever. Buyer representation regarding compensation. Buyer represents that as of the date signed by buyer below, the buyer has signed a representation with the buyer's broker, and the amount specified in paragraph 1 is no more than the amount buyer is obligated to pay buyer's broker pursuant to the buyer representation agreement, and if applicable, less any amount that others have agreed to pay buyer's broker. That would be like a third party. By delivery of buyer representation agreement, buyer authorizes buyer's broker and if applicable, escrow holder upon request to deliver to seller or seller's broker a copy of the portion of the buyer representation agreement identifying the compensation. Buyer has agreed to pay buyer's broker, such as the last page of the car form BRBC, which I just showed you. Third-party beneficiary, seller acknowledges and agrees that buyer's broker is a third-party beneficiary for this agreement and may pursue seller for failure to pay the amount specified in this document. So that's the SPBB form. Any questions about the changes to that form or that form in general? Rebecca, I agree. I think that would be really good is to have a separate class that talks about kind of how we would use all these forms together. Absolutely. It's a good thing our summer schedule is light and we can add things in. A, B, C, D, whoops, D, B. All right. If there are no other, yes. So Sadie, absolutely. If we're negotiating that commission, the other agent says, yes, the seller is willing to pay, or we're trying to negotiate directly with the seller using the SPBB form, we would check the box on the RPA for the SPBB to be included. We would include a copy of this SPBB form with our offer and a copy of page 5 of the buyer rep agreement. I would just include it so that there's no questions or concerns as to what the buyer is obligated to pay and what we're asking the seller to pay. Absolutely. And again, absolutely, Sadie. And if the listing brokerage is offering a cooperating broker compensation out of their commission, then we would include the CBC, the cooperating broker compensation form, the CBC form. That is what confirms that commission with the listing brokerage of what they're paying us. But again, that should be going away. All right, fabulous. I will see you all in 15 minutes. We're taking a short break. We'll be back in 15 minutes. I don't remember what we're covering. No, we're not covering anything in 15 minutes. We'll be back at 2. I'm providing a break so that you guys can all go be part of the processional there in Vacaville to support the fallen officer. That's way more important than these forms, that we support our law enforcement officers and that family in the loss that you guys had a couple weeks ago. So go be part of that processional. We'll be back at 2 o'clock with our next forms training. Thank you so much, guys. We'll see you soon.
All right. Thank you.
Absolutely.